Those attending these hearings and viewing online are aware that our next expert speaker has presented previously. A testament to his expertise is that he will be doing so again right now. A chemist and laboratory manager, Kevin Ryan, was site manager for Environmental Health Laboratories, a division of Underwriters Laboratories, which at the time the World Trade Center's Twin Towers were built and carried out fire resistance tests on their structural steel components. In 2004, Kevin Ryan was fired for publicly questioning the report being drafted by the National Institute of Standards and Technology on the destruction of the Twin Towers. Far from being intimidated or silenced, he has vigorously online Journal of 9/11 Studies and is a co-author of major studies of demolition evidence published by that journal and by the Open Journal of Civil Engineering, the Environmentalist, and the Open Chemical Physics Journal. You'll note the wording open in a couple of those journal titles. Links to these studies and to more than 36 other articles and numerous videos that he has published in the course of his wide-ranging 9/11 research can be found at the website www.ultruth.com. Kevin Ryan offers us a sterling example of courage and integrity in defense of the integrity of science. The subject of his testimony today is extreme temperatures attained during the destruction of the Twin Towers and World Trade Center 7. Please join me in welcoming back Kevin Ryan.
And I'm speaking twice due to the unfortunate circumstance that my colleague, Professor Stephen Jones, could not be here today. But, I'd like to publicly thank him for his leadership and discuss is called Environmental Anomalies at the World Trade Center, Evidence for Energetic Materials. And it was published both online and in print by a Springer journal called The Environmentalist in 2008 and 2009. The authors include myself and 2 others. I'd like to begin with the first of these papers and ask you to notice the maximum temperatures that were cited by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST, at the World Trade Center. NIST reported gas temperatures as high as 1,000 degrees Celsius within its report on the World Trade Center destruction. It's important to note that these are gas temperatures, not the temperatures of solid materials. Others who have publicly supported the fire-induced collapse hypotheses for the buildings, like Professor Thomas Egar from MIT, have suggested the same maximum temperature, while still others have proposed a slightly higher temperature, gas temperature, of 1100 degrees Celsius. But one problem with the maximum temperature cited by officials is that there are many eyewitnesses who claim that metal had been melted at the World Trade Center, and we know that could not have resulted from these temperatures. Here are just a few of the eyewitness statements that were made. The first one is from a man who worked for John Skilling, the design engineer of the World Trade Center towers. He said, "As of 21 days after the attack, the fires were still burning and molten steel was still running." A chaplain at Ground Zero said, "I talked to many contractors, and they said they actually saw molten metal trapped. Beams had just totally been melted because of the heat." Dr. Keith Eaton of the Institute of Structural Engineers said, "I was shown slides of molten metal, which was still red hot weeks after the event." Another doctor from Johns Hopkins School of Public Health said in some pockets now being uncovered, they're finding molten steel. NIST ignored all of these witness statements about molten metal. But I'd like to switch now quickly to a video you've heard tell about, just so you can hear directly from these. Hopefully this will work. From these firemen.
Down below and you'd see molten steel running down the channel rails, like you're in a foundry. Yeah, like lava. Like lava. Down below and you'd see molten steel running down the channel rails, like you're in a foundry. Yeah, like lava. Like lava.
The man speaking is a captain of the New York Fire Department. And this is what he said: molten steel running down the channel rail like lava. This is a photograph that I took of a chunk of a World Trade Center steel column. The sample was brought to my home by someone who received it from a Ground Zero cleanup worker. It's had some interesting features, but unfortunately did not come with a chain of custody explaining its entire history. But on the left here you see molten metal pouring from the South Tower and being pulled from the debris pile at Ground Zero, the World Trade Center site. NIST said that they found no evidence of molten metal. But NIST said if molten metal had been present, it would have had to have been aluminum from the plane. This was not the case, as one can see from these photographs. On the right, you see the difference between molten iron or steel, which is yellow-orange, and molten aluminum, which is silvery gray when poured in the daylight. The temperature required to melt steel is 1,538 degrees Celsius, and it's far above the maximum gas temperature cited in the official report. So the solid temperature, evidence for solid temperatures, are much higher than what officials say the gas temperatures were. In a structural fire, steel temperatures lag behind gas temperatures for a number of reasons, including the thermal conductivity of steel, the effects of convection, and the fireproofing that's applied. Achieving a steel temperature of 1,538 degrees Celsius at the World Trade Center would require gas temperatures that are well above 1,538 degrees Celsius and far above the maximum of 1,000 degrees Celsius cited in the official U.S. government World Trade Center reports. And there is one reference here that I've made from the Structural Fire Protection ASE Manual and Report on Engineering Practice. This is actually directly from that. It says, even in a testing furnace when air temperature is raised and quickly held at 1,000 degrees Celsius, and heat is not conducted away by a large building structure, it takes approximately 2 hours for protected steel to reach just 600 degrees Celsius. And remember, again, one of the towers fell in 56 minutes after impact. This and other indications demonstrate that the NIST reports did not address the evidence. I've seen evidence of the previously molten metal myself in the form of metallic microspheres that I've found in nearly dozen World Trade Center dust samples that I've examined. Here are photomicrographs that I took of the first examples that I received in 2007. So I receive, and you'll see, samples of World Trade Center dust, as do other independent scientists. And we extract particles from the samples of World Trade Center dust. Dr. Stephen Jones of Brigham Young University, who I mentioned, had been examining World Trade Center dust samples prior to myself, and I was interested in seeing what he had seen. These are some of the first examples of the particles I saw. After realizing that such findings could be used in a legal proceeding at some point in the future, we began asking that samples collected by these independent sources be accompanied by documentation that recorded the date, time, and other necessary information, including sample location. Each sample was provided with this information, as well as the signature of the collector and sometimes a witness as well. The process evolved into the use of a standard chain of custody form, which I've used for many years myself as a laboratory manager. Here's an example of one such chain of custody form for a sample I received. I've extracted the metallic microspheres and other paramagnetic particles from the dust in several ways. Now, panelists, you will, I believe, during the next presentation, be given an actual sample to look at. But if you can imagine a plastic bag with dust in it, the microspheres and other particles are extracted by sliding a magnet along the bag to collect them with a spatula, or I found even better taking a magnet, putting it in a plastic bag, inserting that in the first plastic bag, pulling it and inverting it, and that way capturing the paramagnetic particles. On the left here you can see what the content of a typical World Trade Center dust sample looks like under a microscope. These photos are at 100x. On the right are photomicrographs of particles that were extracted with a magnet from the bulk of the same World Trade Center dust sample. At the top of that, you can see the many metallic-looking microspheres and other droplet-shaped metallic particles. Below that are examples of red chip-like materials and other metal-looking objects. And I took all of these photographs myself under a microscope. It's interesting to note that the United States Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, once considered using iron microspheres as a signature characteristic to identify the World Trade Center dust. Here's a document that explains that briefly. For an unknown reason, EPA decided to not designate the iron spheres as a signature characteristic of the dust, despite the fact that it was known to be an unusual identifying characteristic of World Trade Center dust. If we look at the first of the two peer-reviewed scientific papers I mentioned, it begins with a discussion of these metallic microspheres, as well as the finding of semi-transparent silicate-rich microspheres. The paper addresses two independently collected samples that were received for this study. Both samples were collected indoors and shortly after September 11, 2001. One sample was collected on an indoor windowsill on September 14, 2001, just 3 days after the disaster, while search for survivors was going on, and in a building 4 blocks from ground zero. The other sample was acquired inside a 4th-floor apartment whose upper windows broke during the World Trade Center collapse a few days later. On the left is a light microscope image of the microspheres that were extracted, and on the right is a higher resolution image from a scanning electron microscope. An important point to recognize is that the finding of these metallic and silicate microspheres, as well as much more such evidence, had already been reported by other independent researchers apart from the US EPA. The R.J. Lee Group is a corporation specializing in industrial forensics. They were hired by lawyers for the Deutsche Bank to examine the World Trade Center dust as the Deutsche Bank building, which is nearby, was being assessed after 9/11. The USGS is the United States Geological Survey, and they're a federal source in the United States for science about environment and so forth. The USGS coordinated an interdisciplinary environmental characterization of the entire area around the World Trade Center after 9/11. R.J. Lee reported that the quantity of iron spheres in the World Trade Center dust was 5.87%. This is an enormous amount relative to what is found in typical dust samples from office buildings. In fact, it's 150 times as much. How were such microspheres formed? As with water falling or spraying through the air, molten metal forms spheres due to surface tension. The cohesive forces between liquid molecules are responsible for this. When a liquid is falling or sprayed through the air, the molecules at the surface do not have other like molecules all around them, and consequently they cohere more strongly to each other, those directly associated on the surface. Our paper explains that the spheres indicate not only that the iron or silicate was molten at one point, but that due to the small size of the spheres, a violent disturbance of some kind would have been necessary to shatter the molten metal into the small sizes seen. Various explosive or incendiary processes are likely explanations. Here are excerpts from the R.J. Lee report in which it stated clearly that iron melted. But the report says that lead was melted as well, and that such particles are absent in typical office dust. They said that various metals, notably iron and lead, were melted during the World Trade Center event, producing spherical metallic particles. High heat exposure of the dust has also created spherical vesicular silicate particles, and these are classic examples of high temperature or combustion byproducts, generally absent in typical office dust. Surprisingly, these researchers also reported that aluminosilicates were evaporated at the World Trade Center, as indicated by the Swiss cheese appearance of some of the particles examined in the dust. The United States Geological Survey found the same iron and silicate spheres throughout the World Trade Center dust and could not find an explanation. At the top here you see a micrograph of one of the iron-rich spheres that the USGS found. No explanation was given. Two members of our research team submitted a Freedom of Information Act request to the USGS for any other information that might not have been reported. To our surprise, the USGS responded with data showing that their group had found molybdenum microspheres in the World Trade Center dust. The bottom image here shows an SEM image from the USGS of one of these molybdenum spheres. To be clear, the presence of these molybdenum spheres indicates that there was molten molybdenum at the World Trade Center site, and the temperature required for this is very high. Our research team, led by Dr. Stephen Jones and Dr. Jeffrey Farrar at Brigham Young University, analyzed the metallic microspheres we found in World Trade Center dust by a technique called X-ray energy dispersive spectroscopy, or XEDS. This is a technique that provided the elemental composition of the spheres. In other words, it told us what elements the spheres were composed of. The result was that the spheres we found were very high in iron and low in other elements. This agreed with the findings of the R.J. Lee group. You can see the trace in the lower section on the left from R.J. Lee and how it matches with the trace on the right from our team. The discoveries related to these high temperatures continued. R.J. Lee further reported that lead not only melted, it had volatilized. That is, lead had actually vaporized at the World Trade Center, according to the R.J. Lee Research Group. R.J. Lee reported that extremely high temperatures during the collapse caused metallic lead to volatilize, oxidize, and finally condense on the surface of mineral wool. They said that metals were vaporized at the World Trade Center during the event and either deposited on World Trade Center dust or deposited directly onto surfaces in the building. They also talked about Swiss cheese appearance and the result of boiling and evaporation, and that some particles show evidence of being exposed to a conflagration such as spherical metals and silicates and vesicular particles having a Swiss cheese appearance. This is in addition to the findings that aluminosilicate materials had evaporated. So this is the important point of all this, that the temperatures required to explain this evidence, listed here, cannot be explained by the temperatures given in the official reports on the World Trade Center. The temperatures required to melt iron, vaporize lead, melt molybdenum, and vaporize aluminosilicates give evidence for an environment at the World Trade Center that was nearly 2,000 degrees hotter than what official investigators reported. And as John Cole mentioned, to provide even more corroboration for these findings, we need only look to the official U.S. government report that preceded the current one published by NIST. The first report was from FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Administration. Appendix C of their report provided strong evidence of extremely high temperatures at the World Trade Center in the form of highly corroded and eroded steel samples saved from the buildings after they were destroyed. FEMA described samples of steel that had been thinned to razor sharpness. In some cases, there were inexplicable holes in the steel. The fire engineering professors who found the samples could not come up with an explanation for it. They also could not explain the sulfidation of the steel. That is, steel had been chemically changed at the microstructural level in ways that indicated a chemical eutectic mixture had been achieved between sulfur, iron, and oxygen, causing steel to melt. So, as Mr. Cole has already covered this, I'll state again that the New York Times called these findings the greatest mystery of the World Trade Center investigation. The Firewise professors who wrote the study said that a detailed study would need to follow up to determine the causes. That detailed study was never done, and NIST completely ignored these findings. Other evidence for extremely high temperatures at the World Trade Center site include the finding of fused metal and concrete artifacts, like the meteorite, as it's called. This is a mass of molten steel and concrete found at the site, all fused into one big chunk. It also includes the thermal hotspots measured by NASA remote sensing instruments that measure temperature via electromagnetic radiation emitted from the surface. Surface temperatures in the debris piles were found to be as high as 750 degrees Celsius a week after 9/11.
Is that an aerial photo on the right?
Yes, sir.
And are shadows what are providing the dark spots?
Yes, it's all a matter of reading temperature via infrared radiation.
Thanks.
As you've heard already today, there's an explanation for all this officially unexplained evidence. This explanation is that the thermite reaction was present and occurring at the World Trade Center on 9/11 and afterward in the pile at the World Trade Center site. The thermite reaction is an extremely exothermic chemical reaction between aluminum powder and a metal oxide. The metal oxide is typically iron oxide, which you can see here on the left with the reddish color. But it can also be copper oxide, molybdenum oxide, vanadium oxide, for example. The temperature at which thermite burns approaches 3,000 degrees Celsius for some mixtures, which would explain the evidence discussed so far in this testimony. The products of an aluminum iron oxide thermite mixture are molten iron and aluminum oxide, which quickly forms a white dust cloud as it cools. Additives like sulfur improve the burn properties of thermite. And again, a sulfur-containing thermite, which is called thermate, as Mr. Cole mentioned, would explain the evidence found by the FEMA investigators. Look again at the color of the molten iron product from these thermite reactions. It's yellow-orange, like the photos of molten metal from the World Trade Center. Here are those photos again. Are we looking at molten iron at the World Trade Center or molten aluminum, which is silvery gray, when poured in the daylight? Some have suggested that a thermite reaction is the explanation for the molten iron, but it's an innocuous explanation because there was aluminum in the planes and rusty metal, or iron oxide, in the buildings. These innocent components of the buildings and planes might have caused the thermite reaction to occur, some have claimed. But unlike NIST, we actually tested that hypothesis. You can see here that a colleague poured molten aluminum over a rusty steel rail and found that the thermite reaction will not occur in that scenario. This was expected because thermite mixtures are powders mixed in an exact ratio that require a high temperature ignition device to ignite. And of course, the natural thermite hypothesis would not explain the molten molybdenum found by the USGS and the R.J. Lee group. Let's move to the second of the two papers that I mentioned earlier. The second paper focuses on air emission data produced by EPA and the University of California, Davis. The latter actually being aerosol data. Before going into the environmental data, the paper reviews some important facts about the environment at ground zero in the days, weeks, and months after 9/11. Those important facts include that the fires could not be put out and continue to burn in one place or another throughout the piles, even into February 2002. Several inches of dust covered the entire area after the destruction of the buildings. Millions of gallons of water were sprayed into the debris pile. Several rainfall events, some of them heavy, occurred at the site. And a chemical fire suppressant called pyrocool was pumped into the piles, but had little or no effect. Such fires are not typical of structure fires and cannot be explained by typical office fire phenomena. The EPA data was released to my local investigative group, which is called the 9/11 Working Group of Bloomington. After reviewing this data, I noticed that certain patterns in extreme emissions were occurring at the World Trade Center site. Here's an example of those unusual patterns. These 5 chemicals, all of the type called volatile organic compounds, or VOCs, exhibited spikes in detection on the same dates. As you can see from this table, all of these compounds were emitted into the air at high levels on the dates given. These are the byproducts of the combustion of plastics, which often burn only partially in a fire. The levels at which these VOCs were seen at the World Trade Center site was unprecedented. As an example, consider that benzene has been seen at levels as high as 26 parts per billion in structure fires, and benzene seen in the high traffic areas of urban settings from traffic exhaust with mean levels of about 4 parts per billion. And at the World Trade Center site, benzene was seen in bursts of 80,000 parts per billion and higher. These VOC levels seem to indicate that plastics and other organic materials were burning to completion, and more importantly, doing so very rapidly within the pile at ground zero. Similar spikes in other chemical compounds were seen, specifically spikes in detection of iron, aluminum, compounds of silicon, and compounds of sulfur, spikes in rare metals like vanadium. And the EPA noted that it had never before seen the organic compound 1,3-diphenylpropane. Eric Swartz, a research scientist at EPA, noted that 1,3-diphenylpropane was pervasive and was found at levels that, quote, dwarfed all others. One use of 1,3-diphenylpropane is to stabilize the structure of nanocomposite materials. It's a lot of information, I realize. The graph at the top here shows the aerosol data produced by a team from the University of California, Davis, near the World Trade Center site in October 2001. Again, you see the corroboration of the EPA findings in that there are spikes in detection of silicon compounds and as well as aluminum and iron. You see to the far right there. Below this are statements from their report, which are important, in which they say several problems could not be explained. They say we see very fine aerosols, typical of combustion temperatures far higher than the World Trade Center collapse piles. Far higher than they expected, is what they mean. We see some elements abundantly and others hardly at all. Despite similar abundances in the collapse dust, we see organic species in the very fine mode that would not survive high temperatures. So some odd things were happening here. Most importantly, these spikes in detection.
Kevin, could you just say a word on how that particular body of data was collected by the UC Davis people?
Yeah, they had sensors within a short distance from ground zero during the month of October, and they're detecting compounds. They actually misreported a little bit, and they speak about elements, but they're actually detecting compounds. And
would this
aerosols.
Would this, for example, be a composite from many different sites, or would they just have one set up, or do we know, or does it matter?
They set themselves up downwind from the ground zero area to collect data related to ground zero, to the World Trade Center site. Does that help explain?
Yeah.
Okay. These data are compelling when one considers that there's a form of thermite that contains silicon compounds and organic materials, which you may hear about a little bit more in the next presentation. This is called nanothermite, or sometimes called superthermite. I'll leave the majority of the discussion to Dr. Harrett, but I hope you'll recognize a couple of facts. First, the compounds detected at the World Trade Center site in spikes and at extreme levels indicate the presence of violent fires occurring rapidly on specific dates. These compounds also match well with sulfur-containing thermate and with nanothermite. Secondly, the official investigators are not willing to examine or even discuss these data. I've made nanothermite myself via formulations published by the U.S. National Laboratories. On the left here you see a photomicrograph I took of a particle extracted from the World Trade Center dust. On the right is a photomicrograph of a nanothermite material that I made. And below that's a photo of the ignition of that nanothermite. And I'd like to show you again a short video. Years after 9/11, we sorry. There we go. I'll just show you a little bit of this. Most importantly, the last part. I'm trying to give you a demonstration of what happens with nanothermite here. But basically, nanothermite is a solution-made thermite. It's iron chloride dissolved in organic solvents. We add a propylene oxide scavenger material, which turns that into iron oxide. And then you can add organic compounds to this solution. And the important thing is that the organic compounds generate gas when the material is ignited. It does pressure volume work and makes it explosive, generates gas. Of course, aluminum is added as well. But on request, I was asked to... If we take just a couple grams of this nanothermite and put it in a smaller beaker on a hot plate, and raise the hot plate to its maximum temperature, which is 550 degrees Celsius, this should cause the material to ignite. We'll add a loose lid to the beaker to demonstrate the pressure volume work effects that the expanding gas should produce. Even with this very small quantity, it should ignite rapidly and cause explosive gas effects that can be seen. Let's look at it again. As expected, we did see rapid ignition, less than a second to ignite at all, and rapid gas expansion. More backyard experiments. Corporations and corporate-led investigations, I guess, have better facilities. When we look, this is an important point, when we look at the ignition residues, they're strikingly similar to the appearance of the World Trade Center dust particles that were extracted with a magnet from the bag. Both are the same colors, they show the same metallic microspheres, and both exhibit the same kind of vesicular formations that suggest high temperature reactions or explosive effects. There are just two more points which I'd like to make with regard to the high temperatures at the World Trade Center site. The first is that there was a huge dust cloud that arose from the destruction of the buildings. Again, you've heard about this. It was similar to that of a volcano. In other words, it was a pyroclastic-like cloud and appeared to be driven, therefore, by energy sources that exceeded the energy available from the gravitational collapse. Calculations done by researcher Jim Hoffman, based on photographs of the size and distribution of these clouds, have confirmed that the energy is not accounted for by gravitational effects alone. If you'd like to see that, it's at the site 911research.com. Another striking fact is that the dust cloud was very hot and was burning people and setting objects on fire. Here are photos of the many vehicles that were set on fire or burned in the area. A member of the New York City Fire Patrol was asked what he thought was the cause of those vehicle fires. The question was, everybody tells me that all these vehicles were on fire. What do you attribute all these vehicles being on fire to? And Paul Coran of the New York City Fire Patrol responded, I believe it must have been from the debris falling, and the heat just started hitting the cars and starting cars on fire. There were an awful lot of cars burning, an awful lot. It had to be radiated heat or just stuff falling on cars and setting them on fire. There were numerous cars burning. There were also many witnesses to the cloud being very hot and burning people as it passed by. Includes Thomas Spinard from the New York Fire Department, said the dust cloud hit us, it got real hot, it felt like it was going to light up. Another man said a hot solid black wave of heat threw him down the block. Another said a hot billowing cloud of death chased us through the narrow streets of lower Manhattan. Another man said some hot stuff went down his back and he had first and second degree burns on his back from that. Another said that he was running and stuff was coming down. He could feel the heat. I didn't make much farther. It was really hot because this time there was a fire. I know that because my neck was burned. Here are more witness statements to that effect. One man said that his socks were on fire from running through this cloud. Another said that he ran west somewhere and got blown off, got burned on the back of his back. Another said the smoke was hot and that scared him. This is a paramedic. An incredible amount of wind, debris, and heat. A huge, huge, huge blast of hot wind, gusting, and smoke and dust of all kinds hitting him. The super hot wind, and so forth. As for the air emissions, it is important to remember, if nothing else, for the fact that these people made sacrifice for us to some extent. That there are many thousands of people who responded to the tragedy in New York by working to search for survivors, clean up the site, and get Lower Manhattan back into working order. Thousands of these people have become sick and are dying from the exposure they had. The U.S. government ignored them for many years and finally passed a bill last year providing limited medical support. In conclusion, I think this is the evidence that needs to be considered. There are photographs and witness testimony of molten metal at the World Trade Center. This cannot be explained by the temperatures given by the official reports. There clearly were extremely high temperatures evidenced by metallic and other microspheres, evaporated metal, and silicates in the World Trade Center dust. FEMA reported findings of eroded steel and sulfidation, which have not been explained officially. NASA provided images of high surface temperatures, again not explained. Fires could not be put out at the World Trade Center site. There were unusual spikes in volatile organic chemical emissions, suggesting abrupt, violent fires on specific dates, and unusual species in the environmental monitoring data also corresponding to specific dates, suggesting the presence of thermitic materials. There were high temperature problems noted by the University of California Davis team, and there are similarities, again, throughout all of this to products of thermate and nanothermite. These vehicles were passing through the cloud, was setting them on fire, and there were many witness testimonies to a hot wind and cloud. So thank you.
Thank you, Kevin Roan. Well, you know the drill, panelists. Questions? Professor Johnson?
Thank you, Kevin. Question is, how exotic is nanothermite? You can't go down to the Home Depot and get it, I assume. But you made it yourself, so I assume that it's not all that exotic. What are the sources?
Nanothermite, as we call it, also goes by the name superthermite. It's a form of a metastable intermolecular composite as well, sometimes called energetic nanocomposites. So many names for the same sort of thing. They began to be developed in the early 90s, largely by the U.S. national laboratories of the Department of Energy, Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, Los Alamos National Laboratory, and so forth. As far as the ingredients, it depends. There are different types of nanothermite. You can have that's made in the same way that thermite is made, in terms of just simply being a physical mixture of powders. In this case, the powders are very difficult to make on the nanometer scale. There's certain techniques, for example, something called arrestive reactive milling, very high-tech technique. But the methodology that I used is called sol gel nanothermite. So it's a solution that gels, sol gel. And this is the type developed by the national laboratories at Lawrence Livermore. Necessarily easy, and it's not necessarily of high quality. Nanoaluminum will passivate very quickly. It'll oxidize the surface. causing it to be less reactive. But there are chemicals that are expensive. Propylene oxide is a flammable and carcinogenic chemical required in this process. Can't be delivered to your home, so you need to have a place you can have it delivered. Viton is a chemical that I used. I had to go through the Dow distributor and pay a fairly high price and explain that I wasn't trying to but yes, it could be done. You could do it yourself.
Yes. Professor Lee?
Is it the case that nanothermite or thermite is one of the prime elements or the prime devices used by controlled demolition experts to cut through steel girders?
No, I would say absolutely not. And in fact, I think what's important here, though, if I may, is that we're not really talking about a demolition theory.
No.
We're talking about a deceptive demolition theory. And nanothermite can be used in a number of ways. For example, to provide fire that wouldn't have otherwise been there, for lack of oxygen, for example. They can also produce explosive effects, and it can be hidden to some degree, maybe better than other things.
So why are we devoting so much attention to it if it's not would have nothing to do with a demolition hypothesis?
So I tried to answer that. We really don't have a demolition hypothesis. We have a deceptive demolition hypothesis. In my opinion, people did not say, it wasn't a question, we're going to demolish the World Trade Center towers. The question was, how are we going to demolish the World Trade Center towers and make it look like planes caused the towers to fall? So then we're looking for things that can be applied to the World Trade Center tower. And building 7 down, when in fact it was some other sort of high technology affair.
I'm still grappling with that. That suggests that let's put it this way, that the presence of nanothermite is not a fingerprint of a controlled demolition.
I think we've agreed on that. So here's an analogy I give. So we've found residues that appear very much like nanothermite, and I think in the next presentation you'll see a stronger conclusion to that. We've found metallic microspheres that form on these red chips, look just like nanothermite residues, in fact have the same chemical fingerprint of thermite residues. So it's like, the analogy I use is that scientists believe that Saturn's moon Titan, there's a moon around Saturn, has an atmosphere containing methane. They only have one real strong clue about that. That's the wavelength of the light being received at the Earth. They don't argue about it, though. Nobody says, how did the methane get there? Why is it there? They know it's there. So it's the same sort of thing with this evidence. If we find the residues of thermitic materials in the World Trade Center dust, we have evidence for the extreme temperatures that really are only explained by thermitic materials, unless someone else has a solid, experimentally proven hypothesis that could compete. We're stuck with the idea that we found thermitic residues in the World Trade Center dust. We can't deny that. We can't necessarily say, well, controlled demolition people, they don't use nanothermite to bring buildings down. It's the same as with the moon. The other moons don't have methane on it, so Titan couldn't have it on it. Do you see the analogy I'm trying to make? Does that make sense? Okay.
I'm working on it.
Okay.
Mr. Kevin Ryan. We have heard the important and complementary scientific inquiries by Kevin Ryan, Richard Gage, David Chandler, Graham McKean, and John Cole that have provided support to the theory of controlled demolition, whose cause is not unequivocal: bomb, fires, termites, explosives. In certain cases, bombs are involved, in others fire or termitic explosives.
Judge, could you speak more closely to the microphone, please? Thank you. Thank you.
Would it is possible to reach a synthesis where different experts, as ballistic and chemical experts, can each other integrate their knowledge? Because there are differences sometimes in this, even if they are very, very important, but there is some problem for a person like me that is not expert.
Right. If I understand you correctly, Judge, you're recommending that a more interdisciplinary team be assigned to evaluate this evidence. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yes. I agree. I agree, and we're looking for that kind of recommendation, I think, within these hearings. Where do we go from here? We're not saying we have the answers to everything. Here's evidence. Here's evidence that the official investigations did not address. That an alternative hypothesis is beginning to form, but is not complete. And so where do we go from there with this?
Okay.
Yeah, Professor Johnson.
It's my understanding that NIST has had some considerable experience working with nanothermites. They have done a lot of work with these materials. Was there any mention in any of the reports coming out of NIST looking for nanothermite?
No, good question. Perhaps a leading question. I happen to have written a paper looking into that very subject. But I wondered myself how the NIST folks could not imagine an explosive thermite, because it had been being developed at the Department of Energy for many years, 10 years before 9/11. NIST was participating in those studies. NIST directors were writing papers with the world's leading nanothermite experts. NIST, their largest contingent of non-government employees was a corporation called Science Applications International Corporation, which has more ties to the major features of the 9/11 events than I could have predicted, from providing the information to capture Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, to providing the explanation for the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, for participating to the NIST World Trade Center 9/11 investigation, SIC, and they're also experts in nanothermite. One of their subsidiaries even does research on the ignition of nanothermites with lasers, for example. So your point is well taken, that the materials engineers and specialists at NIST that were associated with the investigation, with NIST Advisory Committee, had quite a few very knowledgeable people with regard to nanothermites. And the odd thing is that they never, in all of the answers back and forth, they would never imagine nanothermites as being a possibility. It seems odd.
Other questions? Professor Lee, would you like to return to your question, line of questioning about thumbprint evidence?
Okay, so here's what let me play back to you what I got.
Okay.
And I'm not sure I'm on the wavelength about the moon Titan and so on. But is it the case that, certainly for starters, the presence of nanothermite or thermitic residues is proof positive that the temperatures in the fires were way beyond anything that could be produced by jet fuel or office materials burning. Is
Okay.
that
No,
where
I
we're
would
at?
say, I would say the
Okay.
presence of molten metal, the presence of molten molybdenum, the presence of vaporized lead, vaporized aluminosilicates are strong evidence from, independently from anybody questioning 9/11, strong evidence that extreme temperatures existed far beyond anything reported by official investigators. That's established.
That's all there, but is nanothermite one piece of that puzzle?
Professor Lee, that's a hypothesis, that because now we've searched through the World Trade Center dust and found these magnetic particles that match in many ways the characteristics of nanothermite, that nanothermite, from my presentation, see, you haven't gotten the whole story yet, of course. There's a whole nother paper that essentially establishes conclusively that nanothermite is present in the World Trade Center dust. I haven't mentioned that at all. I'm kind of leading up to the next presentation.
All right.
But so I can understand you might be being confused that maybe I'm trying to establish that here. All I'm kind of doing is introducing it.
Okay. Okay.
Professor Jenkins.
I don't have a question, but I have a brief comment. I appreciate the care that you've shown in this presentation and the analytical skill that you have shown us. Thank you.
Professor Lee, we still have 10 minutes.
Okay. Since we still have a few minutes, let me open another line of inquiry, and that is that you mentioned in passing, you had that nice slide of the benzene and the products of the combustion of plastics. And of course, that is highly, when we think about incineration of waste and so on, that's a very hot topic in environmental studies. And so, but on our 4 days of panels, we don't have anything that really pursues the important issue of the disastrous medical fallout that has befallen the first responders.
Right.
And so it may be, would you care to comment further on that? And, yeah.
Yeah. Professor Lee, I believe you're going to appreciate the presentation by Professor Harrod.
Okay.
I don't want to upstage him.
All right.
Does that seem fair?
Fair.
Okay.
Professor Lee,
Yeah.
if I may, would you accept that what Kevin Ryan has delivered proves the presence of extraordinary heat that cannot otherwise be explained by the official story? I'm getting back to your original line of
Right.
questioning. There
Right.
seems to be still not quite aligned, so for what it's worth.
Yes, and so by adding that it's the molybdenum and the other evidence and the molten metal, that certainly struck me back in 2001, that was pools of molten metal in the rubble weeks and months after the event, that suggested something that there was no official explanation for at all, and then it seemed to have been completely ignored in the, so you've definitely put that into the mix and on the table.
Other questions, panelists? Good, thank you. Kevin Ryan. These hearings will now recess until 3:45. Again, you know the drill. Please be certain to take your seats well in time. Than 36 other articles and numerous videos that he has published in the course of his wide-ranging 9/11 research can be found at the website www.ultruth.com. Kevin Ryan offers us a sterling example of courage and integrity in defense of the integrity of science. The subject of his testimony today is extreme temperatures attained during the destruction of the Twin Towers and World Trade Center 7, Please join me in welcoming back Kevin Ryan.
And I'm speaking twice due to the unfortunate circumstance that my colleague, Professor Stephen Jones, could not be here today. But, I'd like to publicly thank him for his leadership and
those attending these hearings and viewing online are aware that our next expert speaker has presented previously. A testament to his expertise is that he will be doing so again right now. A chemist and laboratory manager, Kevin Ryan, was site manager for Environmental Health Laboratories, a division of Underwriters Laboratories, which at the time the World Trade Center's Twin Towers were built and carried out fire resistance tests on their structural steel components. In 2004, Kevin Ryan was fired for publicly questioning the report being drafted by the National Institute of Standards and Technology on the destruction of the Twin Towers. Far from being intimidated or silenced, he has vigorously online Journal of 911 Studies and is a co-author of major studies of demolition evidence published by that journal and by the Open Journal of Civil Engineering, the Environmentalist, and the Open Chemical Physics Journal. You'll note the wording open in a couple of those journal titles. Links to these studies and to more
than steel was still running. A chaplain at Ground Zero said, I talked to many contractors, and they said they actually saw molten metal trapped. Beams had just totally been melted because of the heat. Dr. Keith Eaton of the Institute of Structural Engineers said, I was shown slides of molten metal, which was still red hot weeks after the event. Another doctor from Johns Hopkins School of Public Health said in some pockets now being uncovered, they're finding molten steel. NIST ignored all of these witness statements about molten metal. But I'd like to switch now quickly to a video you've heard tell about, just so you can hear directly from these. Hopefully this will work. From these firemen.
Down below and you'd see molten steel running down the channel rails. Like you're in a foundry. Yeah. Like lava. Down below and you'd see molten steel.
I'd like to begin with the first of these papers and ask you to notice the maximum temperatures that were cited by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST, at the World Trade Center. NIST reported gas temperatures as high as 1,000 degrees Celsius within its report on the World Trade Center destruction. It's important to note that these are gas temperatures, not the temperatures of solid materials. Others who have publicly supported the fire-induced collapse hypotheses for the buildings, like Professor Thomas Egar from MIT, have suggested the same maximum temperature, while still others have proposed a slightly higher temperature, gas temperature, of 1,100 degrees Celsius. But one problem with the maximum temperature cited by officials is that there are many eyewitnesses who claim that metal had been melted at the World Trade Center, and we know that could not have resulted from these temperatures. Here are just a few of the eyewitness statements that were made. The first one is from a man who worked for John Skilling, the design engineer of the World Trade Center towers. He said, as of 21 days after the attack, the fires were still burning and multiple discuss is called Environmental Anomalies at the World Trade Center, Evidence for Energetic Materials. And it was published both online and in print by a Springer journal called The Environmentalist in 2008 and 2009. The authors include myself and 2 others.